What does it really mean to change your identity? To not just move to a new country, not just marry into another culture, not just adjust your daily surroundings, but to stand at the crossroads of who you were raised to be and who you believe you are becoming? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because that's what this moment is really about. Forget the headlines. Forget the late-night jokes. Forget the tabloid melodrama. Strip all of that away, and what remains is something deeply human. A man who was born into a destiny he never asked for, now being asked if he is ready to give up the last thread of that destiny forever. That is what the question truly meant when Hassan Minhaj leaned forward, locked eyes, and asked, "Are you going to become a U.S. citizen?" Not a small question, not a casual topic, not a piece of celebrity gossip. Identity, home, loyalty, belonging, the heart of who we are. And Harry answered, clearly, directly, and yet with a weight behind the words. There are no plans to be, at this point. 7 words. But everything was inside them. The past, the present, the tension, the conflict. 7 words that stunned, confused, and fascinated people around the world. Because the question everyone heard was about citizenship. But what Harry was really responding to was something much bigger. Where does he belong? Let's rewind. Let's slow this down. Let's walk into the scene. Picture this. A simple studio. Lights, but not blinding ones. Casual atmosphere. The tone isn't confrontational. It's playful. It's royal rapid fire. A segment meant to be fun, fast, lighthearted. Quick questions, snap responses, no deep dives. Just reactions. Hassan Minhaj is in host mode. Sharp, warm, curious. Harry is relaxed, shoulders down, conversational, comfortable, almost informal in a way we didn't see when he was a royal working senior duties. There's a looseness now, a California calmness, a way of speaking that says, I choose my environment now. Then comes the question that slices through all of that casual softness. Are you going to become a U.S. citizen? It is asked lightly, but the room shifts. You don't hear it. You feel it. Harry's expression doesn't freeze, but it pauses. Just enough to notice. Just enough to tell the story. And the story is this. He knew this question was coming. He has been asked variations of it for years. But answering it out loud, on the record, without preparation, without a press release, without a carefully worded palace statement, that's different. And he answers, there are no plans to be, at this point. Not no, not absolutely not, not never, but also not yes. It is the answer of a man who is still figuring out who he is. So here's the real question for us. Why does it matter? Why do millions of people, from royal commentators to political analysts to ordinary viewers, care whether Prince Harry becomes a U.S. citizen? Why is this conversation not simply about immigration paperwork? Because this is not about legality. This is about symbolism. Becoming a U.S. citizen would mean, formally, publicly, and permanently, stepping out of one identity and crossing into another. It would represent a kind of closure, a severing, a defining moment that says, I am not who I was born to be. I am choosing something new. And when someone's identity was shaped on the world stage, in front of cameras, newspapers, and public imagination, that choice becomes global. Prince Harry has already walked away from royal duties. He has already built a new life in California. He has already faced the consequences of stepping outside the palace walls. But citizenship, that's a different level. Because citizenship signals allegiance. It signals place. It signals where you stand when the world draws lines. Think about the contrast. Harry grew up in one of the most structured cultural environments in the world. Royal duty, royal hierarchy, royal expectation, royal legacy. His identity was defined before he was old enough to speak his own name. And then he left it. Not for exile, not for scandal, but for freedom. We watched that unfold in stages. The interviews, the statements, the decisions, the Oprah moment, the memoir, the documentaries, the silence, the reactions. But at every step, even in the upheaval, Harry remained British. Culturally, emotionally, symbolically. The accent, the memory of home, the ties to his mother, the institution that shaped him, the unspoken thread that still ties him to something royal, whether he likes it or not. So when Hassan Minhaj asks, are you going to become a U.S. citizen? He's not asking about immigration papers. He's asking, are you ready to let go? Are you ready to belong somewhere else? Are you ready to redefine your identity forever? And Harry's response? There are no plans to be at this point. This answer is layered, controlled, deliberate. It keeps the door open while keeping the consequences at arm's length. Because if he had said yes, the reaction would have been explosive. Royal commentators would declare it betrayal. British tabloids would scream abandonment. Political analysts would speculate about Meghan's influence. The monarchy would be forced to respond, even if indirectly. If he had said no, the headlines would shift in a different direction. Claims he regrets moving, rumors of reconciliation, stories of missing home, narratives of return. There are no plans to be, at this point, is the only answer that gives him space. And here is where the emotional weight lies. Harry is still searching for identity, searching for purpose, searching for home. That's what this story is about. Not citizenship, belonging. Because belonging is not automatic. It is not guaranteed. It cannot be bought, inherited, or declared. Belonging is earned, and it is chosen. Now pause. Because before we go further, before we look forward, we need to look back. How did we get here? How did a man born third in line to the British throne, raised in palaces, trained for royal duty, watched by the world since infancy, end up in California, sitting in a casual podcast studio, answering questions about becoming American? What happened in the years before this moment? What decisions? What fractures? What heartbreaks? What awakenings? Because this answer didn't just appear out of thin air. It was built over time, step by step, conversation by conversation, realization by realization. And the moment everything changed wasn't when Harry moved to California. It happened long before that, in places we never looked, in moments the press didn't see, in emotions that weren't spoken aloud. And to understand his answer, truly understand it, we must go back to the breaking point. Because that moment explains everything that follows. And the breaking point wasn't the one the world thinks it was. What if a single sentence could reveal the state of a man's heart? Not the statement itself, but the breath before it, the pause, the hesitation, the slight shift in tone. Because words are easy to recite, but meaning? Meaning has a pulse. Meaning has weight. Meaning has consequences. And in this moment, the moment Prince Harry was asked whether he would become a U.S. citizen, the meaning behind his answer spoke louder than any headline could. Picture it. The studio is bright but intimate. It isn't a royal interview, staged with gold-trimmed seats and an audience dressed in politeness. It isn't a press conference where every word is measured for diplomacy. No, the energy here is casual, California casual. The kind of atmosphere where someone could almost forget the weight of their own personal history. And that's important. Because Harry has spent most of his life in environments where forgetting who he is was impossible, where every movement was observed, every expression analyzed. Every answer had to be positioned like a chess piece in a centuries-old narrative of monarchy and tradition. But now, he's just sitting in a studio chair, across from a comedian who isn't intimidated by titles, crowns, or family hierarchies. Hassan Minhaj looks him in the eye as if to say, "I'm not talking to a prince. I'm talking to a person." And Harry responds like one. This is where the atmosphere matters. Because comfort lowers the walls we build around our identity. And Harry, for once, didn't appear guarded. He wasn't bracing for attack. He wasn't preparing to defend himself. He was just answering questions, rapid-fire style. And then, suddenly, it happens. The shift. The tone changes. Hassan's voice remains light, but the question is heavy enough to cut the room in half. Are you going to become a U.S. citizen? Think about that. The way it lands. Not as a logistical question, not as a procedural inquiry, but as something deeper. Because citizenship isn't just paperwork. It's allegiance. It's choosing a nation, choosing a life, choosing a self. And the world leaned in, even if the world didn't realize it. Harry smiles, but not in the casual, joking way he had been moments earlier. This smile has calculation behind it. Not deception, not manipulation, but awareness. Awareness of how big the question really is. Awareness that no matter how he answers, someone will be upset. Someone will interpret it the wrong way. Someone will turn it into a narrative. And he says it. There are no plans to be, at this point. Not yes, not no. Suspended in the in-between. Now here's what most people miss. Harry has learned to answer questions indirectly. Not because he's evasive, but because he was trained to be careful. Words spoken by royals are rarely just words. They become symbols, statements, messages, and symbols take on lives of their own. If he had said yes, he would have been accused of abandoning his country. If he had said no, he would have been accused of regretting his move. So he chose a third path, a middle place. But middle places always reveal emotional truth. Because people who know exactly what they want don't choose the middle. They choose certainty. And this answer is not certainty. This answer is searching. And the silence after he says it is even louder than the sentence itself. The air pauses. Hassan studies him, not with judgment, but with curiosity. Even he can feel that the answer means more than it sounds like. The energy in the room shifts again, because now, for the first time in the conversation, something real has entered the space. Which raises a question, not about Harry, but about us. Why do we expect clarity from someone whose entire life has been built on confusion? Why do we expect certainty from a man who has been taught to suppress his own desires? Why do we demand a final answer from someone who is still in the middle of becoming? This moment reveals something profound. Harry is a man between worlds, and he knows it. He has built a life in America. He has friendships here, work here, a home here. His family, the one he chose to build, is rooted here. His children will grow up with American accents, American cultures, American holidays. Their formative years will be shaped not by London fog and palace gates, but by California's sun, private beaches, and a home where the cameras are outside the walls instead of inside. But identity isn't only about where you live. Identity is about where your earliest memories are formed, where your emotional scars belong, where your roots live, even when you've uprooted your life. And Harry's roots are royal, British, monarchical, inherited, heavy. So when he says, there are no plans to be, at this point, what he is really saying is, I am still figuring out who I am. And yet, that answer shocked people. Why? Because there is a narrative that many expected him to fulfill. The narrative that Harry had chosen America and abandoned the UK. The narrative that Meghan and America represent freedom and that Britain represents trauma. The narrative that moving to the United States was the final step, the point of no return. But it wasn't. Moving was the beginning of self-definition, the beginning of reflection, the beginning of rediscovering identity without titles, without royal hierarchy, without the pressure of being the spare in a dynasty that values heirs above individuals. So when Harry pauses before answering, he is not measuring his words. He is feeling the truth of them. He is a man living in transition, a man who has taken the first step away from the identity assigned to him, but has not yet stepped fully into the identity he is choosing, which leaves him suspended between two worlds, two cultures, two futures. And here is where we must ask the question that most people avoid. Is Harry afraid of choosing? Not in the sense of fear of disruption, because he has already disrupted. Not in the sense of fear of disapproval, because he has already endured wave after wave of public backlash. But in the sense of identity finality. Once you choose a country, you choose a story, a grounding, a belonging. And what if Harry has not found his belonging yet? What if, despite the ocean between him and the place he once called home, his heart has not yet let go? And what if, despite the freedom he has found in Malibu sunrises and Santa Barbara evenings, his soul still feels the pull of a life he didn't choose but can't fully escape? This is the complexity that sits beneath the answer. Not political, not legal, personal. But that's only the beginning. Because the moment Harry said those words, the reaction outside that studio began forming rapidly. Headlines drafting themselves, analysts preparing commentaries, royals noticing, the public dividing, yet again, into two sides. But the part that matters most, the part that has shaped everything since, it didn't start in the studio. It started years earlier, inside the palace walls, in silence, in tension, in the slow, quiet unraveling of a man who was raised to be one thing and realized he could not breathe inside that destiny. And that unraveling is where we go next. Because to understand why this answer mattered, you must understand what came before it. And what came before this moment was the breaking point. What if the most revealing part of a person's answer is the part they don't say aloud? The breath between syllables, the moment their eyes flick away, the slight tightening of the jaw. Because language is not just sound, it is strategy. It is protection. It is confession hidden inside composure. And Harry's sentence, There are no plans to be, at this point, is one of those sentences that says far more than it appears to. Let's sit with it, not rush past it, not treat it like just another celebrity quote. Let's slow it down and listen to it as if it were poetry. Because in a way, it is. Because people who are certain of their decisions speak in absolutes. I will. I won't. I am. I'm not. But Harry? Harry speaks in possibilities. There are no plans to be, at this point. This is not finality. This is not clarity. This is someone who is still navigating the terrain of his own identity. And that's where we begin. Let's break the sentence apart, word by word. Not to analyze Harry like a case study, but to understand the emotional architecture behind his voice. There are no plans. That suggests thought has happened. Discussion has happened. Consideration has happened. You cannot have no plans unless the idea existed in the first place. And we know it did, because Harry said so himself, years earlier, when he admitted that yes, he had considered U.S. citizenship after moving to California, which means the idea isn't foreign to him. It isn't theoretical. It isn't shocking. He has thought about it. He has sat with it. He has imagined the possibility. But then, the second half of the sentence. At this point. This is where the meaning lives. At this point implies change, movement, evolution. At this point means right now is not forever. At this point means this is temporary. At this point means my identity is not finished yet. And that is what stopped people in their tracks. Not the content of the answer, the uncertainty behind it. Because Harry is not a man who is done making decisions. He is a man who is still choosing. And that unsettles people. Because we expect identity to be fixed. We expect belonging to be obvious. We expect public figures to define themselves with certainty, confidently, loudly, permanently. But life doesn't work like that. Identity doesn't work like that. Especially when you were born into a role that overshadowed your individuality from childhood. Think about it. Harry was not raised to be himself. He was raised to be a symbol, a spare, a support to the heir. A public figure whose emotional reality was irrelevant compared to his narrative function. Your identity isn't allowed to evolve naturally when the world decides who you are before you even learn to speak. So the journey Harry is on, the one most of the world is watching, judging, debating, narrating, is actually something that many people experience quietly. The journey of figuring out who you become when the identity others built for you no longer fits. Have you ever outgrown a version of yourself that other people still expected you to be? Have you ever felt a tug of war between your past and your future? Have you ever stood in that invisible doorway between who you were and who you might become? If you have, then you understand Harry. But let's keep going. Because the emotional meaning of that sentence doesn't end with identity. It touches loyalty. And loyalty, when connected to family, is a fragile, powerful thing. Because choosing citizenship isn't just choosing paperwork. It's choosing allegiance. It's choosing where you stand. It's choosing who you consider home. And Harry's situation is unlike anyone else's. If he becomes a U.S. citizen, he could be required to renounce certain royal privileges. He could be formally distancing himself from the monarchy, not just socially or symbolically, but legally. And even though he left royal duties, he hasn't chosen to sever the symbolic thread. Not yet. Why not? Because leaving a system is not the same as leaving a home. Because stepping away is not the same as letting go. Because sometimes the places that hurt you are still the places that shaped you, and losing them feels like losing a part of yourself. Harry's relationship with Britain is complicated. It is where he experienced love, the unconditional love of his mother, Princess Diana. It is where he experienced trauma, the paparazzi storm, the emotional restraint of the monarchy, the pressure of being the spare. It is where he built camaraderie, in the military, on the ground, not as a prince, but as a brother in arms. It is where he experienced betrayal, from certain parts of the press, from some members of the institution, from those who refused to protect him and Meghan. Home is not easy. Home is layered. Home is memory. And citizenship forces the question, where is home for Harry now? California is peaceful, but it is new. Britain is painful, but it is familiar. Which is easier to release? The place you no longer fit, or the place that made you who you are? And here's the thing. Harry does not want to lose his past. He wants to redefine it. He wants to carry certain parts with him. The parts that shaped his values, his love for service, his sense of duty, his connection to military families, his devotion to causes larger than himself. And if he chooses American citizenship, many of those connections would shift, not break, but transform. And transformation is frightening. But here is where the contradiction lives. Harry has already changed. He is already transformed. He is already different. Listen to the way he speaks now. Open, expressive, emotional, reflective. Listen to how he talks about mental health, not as a concept, but as a lived experience. Look at how he shows affection publicly, something the monarchy never encouraged. Look at how he allows himself to be seen, fully, imperfectly human. That's not the Harry who grew up in the palace. That's a Harry who rebuilt himself on the outside. But identity is a long journey, and Harry is still in motion. Which brings us to the heart of the moment. The choice is not simply between British identity and American identity. The choice is between history and reinvention, between memory and becoming, between the comfort of what was known and the uncertainty of what could be. And people misunderstand this as hesitation. It is not hesitation. It is grief. Because to let go of an identity, even one that caused pain, is to let go of a version of yourself that has existed since childhood. And grief, especially identity grief, moves slowly. So yes, Harry paused. Yes, he left the answer open-ended. Yes, his voice held uncertainty. But uncertainty is not weakness. Uncertainty is evolution. And evolution is courage. Because courage is not the absence of fear. It is moving forward while afraid. The world is waiting for Harry to choose. The media is waiting. The monarchy is waiting. America is waiting. But the truth is, Harry is not choosing between two countries. He is choosing who he becomes next. And the road to that decision begins long before California. It begins before Oprah, before Netflix, before Meghan, before the exit, before the press, before the public drama. It begins in the royal corridors of his childhood, in the shadows of palace walls, in the silence of grief that was never allowed to speak. Which is where we're going next. Because everything that led to this moment, every fracture, every awakening, every emotional shift, traces back to a time when Harry was a boy who lost the one person who saw him not as a symbol, but as a son. And that loss wasn't just heartbreak. It was the beginning of the unraveling that brought him to this point and will determine what comes next. But what happened then, in those early years, is not what the world thinks. And when we step into that memory, everything changes. What if the path that brings someone to freedom is also the path that leaves the deepest scars? The truth is, Harry didn't wake up one day in California and decide to live differently. He didn't suddenly choose a new life on a whim. Every step, every decision, every moment of rebellion or retreat was built on years of tension, heartbreak, and quiet desperation. And to truly understand why he gave the answer he did about U.S. citizenship, we need to walk that path with him, all the way back to the beginning of the unraveling. Harry's early life was both extraordinary and suffocating. Born into the center of a centuries-old monarchy, he grew up under constant scrutiny. Every smile captured, every tear noted, every misstep magnified. And yet, alongside that scrutiny, there was love, real, human, grounding love, from his mother, Diana. She was the emotional compass he clung to, the one who saw him as a boy first, not a prince. But when tragedy struck and she was taken from him, the world didn't pause. The press didn't stop. The monarchy didn't ease up. And Harry, suddenly orphaned in the public eye, was forced to navigate grief in the harshest possible spotlight. Imagine losing your mother and having the cameras as your constant companions. Imagine trying to grieve while knowing that millions are watching your every reaction, dissecting your every emotion, comparing it to the polished facade your family demands. It's impossible to overstate the pressure. For a child, and later for a young man, it's not just grief. It's isolation. It's learning that vulnerability is dangerous. It's understanding that identity is negotiable. You have to perform who the world wants you to be. Fast forward to his teen years. Harry's identity was already conflicted. He was the rebellious one. Yes, the party prince, as tabloids often mocked. But those moments of rebellion were more than antics. They were survival. They were tests. They were signals to the world that he was alive, that he was human, that he had agency. He wasn't just a symbol. He was a person. And yet, every act of defiance was noted, criticized, and turned into a narrative that reinforced the very constraints he tried to escape. Then came his early adult years, the military service, the deployments, the moments of real danger, the kind of experiences that strip away privilege and force a man to confront himself. For Harry, the military was liberation. It was a place where rank mattered, yes, but not birthright, where bravery counted more than pedigree, where he could define himself through action rather than expectation. And in that crucible, he began to realize something essential. His life, the one defined by a crown and centuries of tradition, was not the only way to exist. There were other paths, other meanings, other ways to belong. And yet, belonging remained elusive. Because even as he fought overseas, even as he returned to accolades, even as he built a sense of purpose through service, the palace walls followed him. The expectations, the scrutiny, the judgment, and it grew heavier when he fell in love. Meghan, a woman outside of royal convention, a woman who brought new life, new energy, and a radical shift in perspective. To be with her was not merely romantic. It was a declaration. It was a choice that sent shockwaves through the institution and the media. Harry's love for Meghan was met with resistance he could not have anticipated fully. The press unleashed relentless coverage. Certain parts of the public criticized the choice, the timing, the race, the narrative. Everything became a battleground. And through it all, Harry found himself repeating a pattern he had known since childhood, the one where loyalty and identity collided, where the man he wanted to be conflicted with the role he had inherited. This is where we start to understand the significance of his no plans answer. Every decision, every moment of upheaval, every choice to protect his family, to step back from royal duties, was not a light-hearted escape. It was the culmination of decades of tension, of watching the world expect him to be something he could not fully embody. And yet, despite the freedom he began to carve out in California, there remained a tether, a string connecting him to a past that shaped him, defined him, and haunted him. It is worth pausing to consider how radical this journey is. Imagine a life where your identity was prescribed at birth, where every path was predetermined, and then, suddenly, you assert control over your narrative. That assertion is not simply bold. It is seismic. It reverberates through family, culture, and public consciousness. Every step Harry took in stepping back from royal obligations was not just about him. It was about a larger statement of autonomy. And autonomy, especially when claimed in opposition to centuries of tradition, comes with its own profound consequences. And so, California became both refuge and testing ground. It offered sunlight, space, and privacy, luxuries he had never known in the UK, but it also demanded adaptation. Identity cannot exist in a vacuum. You do not merely leave a life. You must recreate it. New friends, new systems, new norms, and new expectations, all while the world watches and comments. And in this new world, the question of citizenship is not just about legal papers. It is about whether he is ready to fully commit to a life he is still in the process of defining. Because every choice carries weight. Choosing citizenship would symbolize a final step away from Britain, a definitive alignment with the new life he built. Yet the man he is cannot abandon the entirety of his past. The history of loss, the history of love, the history of duty, all of it remains a part of him. And navigating that tension is not something that can be rushed, announced, or concluded with a headline. It is a process, a journey, a reckoning. And that brings us back to the moment in the studio. When Harry said those words, he was not simply responding to a question about nationality. He was revealing a truth that the world may not be prepared to understand. Identity is not a switch you can flip. It is a mosaic built over time, with fragments of joy, grief, rebellion, duty, and love. To answer definitively about citizenship would be to claim a finality he is not ready to embrace. The words "no plans at this point" encapsulate years of reflection, pain, and evolution, all delivered in a deceptively simple sentence. But there is more to the story than the words themselves. Because Harry's journey also reveals something universal. We all carry inherited identities, expectations placed upon us by families, cultures, and societies. We all face moments where the choice between past and future is unclear. We all encounter crossroads where belonging, freedom, and self-definition collide. Harry's struggle is magnified by his fame, but the emotional reality is familiar. Deciding who we are is rarely straightforward, especially when our choices affect not only ourselves, but everyone who watches, loves, or depends on us. And so, as we follow him along this road, as we trace the steps that brought him from the palaces of Britain to the sunlit coastlines of California, we see a man who is simultaneously liberated and bound, fearless and cautious, decisive and reflective. The journey that led him here is long, winding, and fraught with contradictions. And it is these contradictions that make his story so compelling. But here is the question that lingers, even as we reflect on his past. If all the steps he has taken to reclaim his identity have brought him to a place of safety and self-definition, why hesitate now? Why leave the door open when a decision could feel like closure? Because identity is never simple. Because belonging is never complete. Because freedom is not a destination, but a process. And because even after all he has endured, Harry is still learning who he truly wants to be and where he truly wants to belong. And what happened next? The breaking point that forced him to reconsider everything, that pushed him to step away from the only life he had ever known, is a story that changes everything. It is the moment when comfort ended and choice began. The moment when a boy who had been defined by a world around him realized he had to define himself. What if the moment that defines a person doesn't arrive with fanfare, but in quiet, unbearable pressure that slowly crushes everything you thought you knew about yourself? For Prince Harry, the breaking point was not a single event. It was a series of collisions, private betrayals, relentless media scrutiny, and institutional rigidity that made every breath feel like a negotiation with a world that didn't see him as human, only as a role he was born into. And it is this breaking point that set the stage for every decision that would follow, including his careful, measured response about U.S. citizenship years later. Let's start at the palace, when Harry was still a young man. The public saw a prince smiling, waving, attending events. The cameras adored him. The people admired him. But behind those smiles, the weight of expectation was immense. Every word he spoke, every action he took, was scrutinized. And the scrutiny was relentless, especially when the tabloids began spinning narratives about Diana's death, his relationship with family, and his future role in the monarchy. Every morning brought another headline. Every evening, another judgment. And the constant pressure built like water behind a dam, quiet at first, almost unnoticed, until the breaking point could no longer be ignored. Harry learned early that vulnerability was a weakness. He saw the consequences when Diana's emotions, no matter how authentic or justified, were exploited and misrepresented. He learned that crying, showing fear, or admitting pain could be twisted into scandal. So he compartmentalized. He built walls around his heart. He performed cheerfulness, humor, and charm. He became adept at masking the turbulence inside with public composure. But walls are not impervious. Eventually, cracks appear. And those cracks became impossible to hide after a certain series of events. The first crack came from inside the family. The tension between personal desire and institutional expectation was constant. Harry was expected to act, speak, and live in ways that aligned with centuries of tradition. He was a spare, but that didn't mean he was invisible. The monarchy has a way of shaping a narrative around those who do not fit perfectly, and Harry felt the pressure acutely. Private disagreements over personal choices, constant judgment from family members, and subtle hints that his feelings and opinions were secondary created a pervasive sense of being trapped. And the tragedy of his mother's death only amplified the pressure, leaving him with grief compounded by institutional silence. Then came the public scrutiny. It was relentless. Tabloids, paparazzi, and social media commentary became a constant storm. There was no refuge, not in private, not in friendship, not even in love. Every romantic relationship, every personal misstep, every casual remark became fodder for speculation and misrepresentation. And when Harry fell in love with Meghan Markle, that storm intensified. Their relationship became a national and global conversation, dissected with precision by the press and commentators. Every move they made together was either celebrated or weaponized. And the attacks were not merely opinion. They were targeted, sometimes cruel, often based on distortion or omission. For Harry, the breaking point was cumulative. It wasn't a single betrayal. It wasn't one scandal. It was the combination of grief, pressure, criticism, and a feeling of being cornered. Every layer of his identity, son, brother, prince, partner, future father, was being challenged simultaneously. The palace demanded loyalty to an institution. The public demanded performance. The press demanded entertainment. And Harry demanded autonomy, the right to exist on his own terms. The collision of these demands was unsustainable. Then came the moments that would define his path forward. Private conversations that went unresolved. Personal feelings dismissed in favor of protocol. Public attacks that cut deeper than he could articulate. Harry began to recognize a simple, terrifying truth. If he remained within the structure of the monarchy as it existed, he would never be allowed to live authentically. He would be defined not by his values or his choices, but by the narrative of duty and expectation. The breaking point was not a dramatic scene in a movie. It was the quiet realization that his life, as scripted by history, could not accommodate the man he wanted to become. And that realization changed everything. Because it wasn't just about stepping away from duty. It was about reclaiming identity, reclaiming family, reclaiming selfhood in a world that had long denied him agency. Choosing freedom meant risking everything he had known: love, title, public perception, and even connection to his homeland. It meant accepting the unknown, and it meant understanding that some people, even family members, would never forgive him for choosing authenticity over tradition. The pressure was compounded by the public nature of every decision. When Harry and Meghan announced their intent to step back from royal duties, the announcement was seismic. The monarchy and the media responded with shock, criticism, and at times, overt hostility. But the public rarely understood that Harry had been processing this choice for years, that this was not impulsive rebellion, but the culmination of an emotional journey he had been navigating in silence. Stepping back was a declaration, a boundary, a refusal to be consumed by a system that prioritized image over well-being. And it came with immediate consequences: isolation from certain family members, global speculation, and a media frenzy that framed their move as betrayal. The breaking point had forced Harry to confront the cost of freedom, and he accepted that cost willingly. Because the alternative, remaining trapped within the expectations and pressures that had defined his life, was no longer bearable. Yet even as he moved to California, the breaking point left traces. Harry was free geographically, but emotionally and psychologically, he carried the weight of loss, judgment, and unfinished grief. His decisions about identity, belonging, and allegiance would be informed by this rupture. And the subtle but powerful phrase, "at this point," in his statement about U.S. citizenship reflects that ongoing negotiation. The breaking point was not a moment that ended. It was a process that continues to shape every choice he makes, every word he speaks, every life he builds. And it is important to note, breaking points are often invisible to the outside world. Most people see the headlines, the interviews, the memoirs, the documentaries, and think the man has arrived at a conclusion. But the truth is that the inner journey is rarely linear. Freedom comes with its own challenges. Every step into autonomy carries echoes of the past, shadows of grief, and questions about where one truly belongs. Harry's journey is emblematic of this universal struggle, magnified by fame, but grounded in human experience. The conflict between inherited identity and chosen identity, between the role expected of you and the life you desire. Which brings us to the central tension that continues to this day. Harry's decision to not commit to U.S. citizenship immediately is not hesitation. It is reflection. It is acknowledgement of the past, even as he shapes the future. It is the understanding that identity cannot be fast-tracked or dictated by external expectations. It is a conscious recognition that the road to selfhood is long, winding, and at times, painful. And yet, despite all the upheaval, Harry's breaking point also unlocked something essential: agency. The ability to choose, to define the terms of his life, to prioritize family, well-being, and authenticity over tradition and expectation. Without that moment of rupture, none of the steps that followed, the move to California, the advocacy work, the public statements, would have been possible. The breaking point, in its quiet, devastating clarity, became the catalyst for transformation. But here's the question that looms over every subsequent choice. How does a man who has been defined by institutions, by legacy, and by grief navigate the delicate balance between his past and his future? How does he step into a new life while honoring the experiences that formed him? And most importantly, how does he decide where he belongs, emotionally, culturally, and legally, when the world expects a definitive answer? The answers are not simple. The journey is ongoing, and the consequences are profound, because the breaking point was only the beginning, the moment that forced him to face himself, question his loyalties, and reconsider the very meaning of home. And what came next, the life he began to construct outside the palace walls, would challenge everything the public thought they knew about Prince Harry. The story continues, and the next chapter reveals the concrete realities of what stepping away meant, the legal, social, and symbolic weight of citizenship, and how Harry's understanding of loyalty and identity began to crystallize in California. Imagine stepping off a plane, leaving behind a life you've known your entire existence, carrying the weight of legacy, grief, and expectation, and arriving somewhere completely new. For Prince Harry, California was not just a relocation. It was a rebirth, a landscape of sunlight, ocean, and possibility where the pressures of the monarchy were distant but never completely gone. It was a place where he could explore identity, family, and purpose on his own terms. And yet, paradoxically, it also forced him to confront what he had left behind and how far he was willing to go to define himself fully. From the moment Harry and Meghan arrived in Los Angeles, the stakes were different. In Britain, everything was amplified: scrutiny, expectation, tradition, media intrusion. California offered a kind of liberation, yes, but it also demanded reinvention. The man who once walked ceremonial halls, attended palace functions, and carried the invisible crown of expectation now had to negotiate daily life as a private citizen in a city that runs at its own rhythm. The contrast could not have been more striking. One moment, a prince surrounded by cameras and ceremonial weight. The next, a man figuring out traffic, schools, healthcare, and home security while attempting to shield his young family from the gaze of the world. And yet, California was more than practical refuge. It was emotional and psychological sanctuary. Sunrises over Malibu, quiet walks in nature, and moments of intimacy with his family provided Harry with space he had never experienced before. For the first time, he could breathe without an audience, grieve without judgment, and explore what it meant to live outside the strictures of the institution that had defined him. He could begin to answer the questions he had long suppressed. Who am I without the crown? What is my role as a husband and father? Where does my loyalty truly lie? But even in freedom, challenges loomed. Identity does not reset simply because geography changes. Harry carried his past, the grief, the trauma, the public scrutiny, into every moment of this new life. He had to reconcile being both a private man and a global figure. In Los Angeles, every casual appearance was analyzed, every social media post scrutinized, every interview dissected for intention and subtext. The media was relentless, and the public's curiosity unending. He could no longer rely on palace walls to protect him. In California, his privacy had to be actively constructed and maintained. And this is where the notion of citizenship became more than paperwork. It became symbolic of identity, belonging, and allegiance. Choosing to become an American citizen would be a public declaration that he was formally stepping into this new life, a step beyond relocation into legal, cultural, and emotional territory. But Harry hesitated, not because he was unsure of his love for his new home, but because citizenship would force him to confront the full meaning of what it means to leave Britain behind, to leave the life he was born into, to redefine loyalty in a way that carries profound personal and public consequences. Even in California, the pull of Britain remained. The relationships with family, the connection to heritage, the love for his mother's memory. All of these threads tethered him emotionally. Distance does not erase history. It does not erase influence. And every decision about the future, including citizenship, had to account for the weight of that tether. Every public statement, every interview, every podcast appearance had to navigate the delicate balance between revealing authenticity and preserving relationships that still mattered, however complexly. Harry also faced practical realities that California life imposed. Legal considerations, residency, taxation, and immigration logistics created tangible pressure points that intersected with emotional ones. Each choice became layered, not simply a question of identity or belonging, but a calculus of security, family stability, and long-term strategy. In other words, citizenship wasn't just a symbolic question. It was an operational and deeply personal decision that affected the trajectory of his entire life and his children's futures. And yet, in spite of these pressures, California allowed for something rare: reflection. Harry could explore the contours of who he was without constant intrusion. He could experiment with ways of being, speaking, and connecting that would have been impossible in Britain. He could engage in advocacy work, support causes he felt passionate about, and use his platform to speak openly about mental health, service, and personal growth. In this sense, California was both refuge and laboratory, a place where identity could be tested, reshaped, and lived authentically. But even as he rebuilt himself, Harry's past was never far away. The monarchy, the media, the British public, all continued to loom over him. The question of citizenship was therefore both literal and metaphorical. Literally, it was about national allegiance. Metaphorically, it represented the ongoing negotiation between past and present, between what was inherited and what was chosen. His answer, "There are no plans to be," at this point, reflects this negotiation. It acknowledges the desire for freedom and the reality of tethered identity. It admits possibility without closure, and it preserves agency while honoring history. The California years also reinforced the human element that had always driven Harry's decisions: family. Meghan, Archie, and Lilibet became central to his sense of purpose. His choices were no longer about ceremony or tradition alone. They were about protecting, nurturing, and creating a stable environment for the people he loved most. California offered that possibility, but with freedom came responsibility and the constant awareness that their privacy, security, and identity were now entirely in their own hands. Every move was deliberate, every step measured, every word weighed. And this tension between freedom and responsibility, past and future, identity and allegiance, is where Harry's story becomes universal. Because even without royal context, all of us face moments where we must redefine ourselves, balance loyalty with self-preservation, and navigate the competing demands of personal and public life. Harry's answer about U.S. citizenship is therefore not just a royal footnote. It is a lens into the complexity of identity, the courage of autonomy, and the ongoing journey of self-definition in the face of expectation. But the story does not end in California. Freedom, while liberating, also surfaces new dilemmas. Privacy is finite. Public curiosity is infinite. The media will always seek to construct narratives. Family dynamics remain unresolved. And the choice of citizenship, while delayed, is never entirely off the table. Harry must constantly weigh loyalty, identity, and legacy against autonomy, safety, and authenticity. The journey that began with leaving the palace continues every day, in ways both visible and invisible, public and private. And what came next? The decision-making moments, the conversations, the strategies, and the public appearances that followed would reveal not only Harry's evolving identity, but also the subtle ways in which the past continues to shape the present. Every interview, every comment, every nuanced answer is part of a story that moves between two worlds, two cultures, and two notions of belonging. And the next chapter will show exactly how the tension between heritage and choice continued to play out, including moments that left the public shocked, allies unsettled, and the monarchy watching closely. What does it mean when the world watches someone leave, only to demand they explain why? For Prince Harry, the royal perspective was never just about ceremony, protocol, or titles. It was about a network of expectations that extended far beyond his personal life. The monarchy functions as both a family and an institution, and for Harry, this duality created a pressure that few could understand. Every decision he made after stepping back, every relocation, every interview, every public comment, was filtered through the lens of tradition, loyalty, and historical precedent. And that filtering process influenced how he responded to even the simplest questions, including the one about U.S. citizenship. Let's consider the royal lens. Within the monarchy, identity is largely fixed. Roles are predetermined, responsibilities are inherited, and personal desires are often secondary. To deviate from the script is not merely frowned upon. It can be considered a betrayal of the institution. And Harry, by stepping back, effectively challenged centuries of expectation. That move was revolutionary, not in the sense of political upheaval, but in the disruption it created in the family and its public narrative. His actions demanded a new framework for understanding loyalty, one that didn't exist in the traditional royal paradigm. And yet, from the palace's perspective, Harry remained a prince. Titles cannot be erased. Bloodlines cannot be ignored. His choices, however autonomous, were inseparable from the monarchy's broader image. Every interview, every public appearance, and even the discussion about citizenship reflected on the crown, creating tension between personal freedom and institutional obligation. And here lies the contradiction. Harry wanted independence, yet independence carries unavoidable echoes of responsibility. A man may step away, but history does not step aside. The question of U.S. citizenship became a litmus test for this tension. On the surface, it seems simple: legal paperwork, allegiance, nationality. But under the surface, it is deeply symbolic. Choosing citizenship is a declaration of where one formally belongs. It signals commitment, loyalty, and identity. And for Harry, answering this question required navigating the delicate balance between honoring his birthright and asserting autonomy over the life he has built. There are no plans to be, at this point, was his way of maintaining equilibrium, acknowledging possibility while protecting relationships and preserving agency. But even as he delivered this answer, the monarchy and the public were reading between the lines. Some interpreted the hesitation as doubt, disloyalty, or lingering connection to Britain. Others saw it as pragmatism, foresight, or reflection. The ambiguity of the statement sparked debates that stretched across tabloids, social media, and think pieces worldwide. Every nuance was dissected: the tone, the phrasing, the timing. And Harry, aware of this, understood that he could never fully control interpretation, only intention. Now, consider the emotional reality behind that statement. Harry's hesitation is tied to loyalty, grief, and legacy. He is a man who has witnessed the cost of public scrutiny, the fragility of trust within his family, and the power of perception. To commit to American citizenship would require a step further away from a past he cannot ignore. Yet to remain undecided allows him to live in a liminal space, where possibility exists, relationships are preserved, and identity continues to evolve. This space, uncomfortable, ambiguous, and complex, is a hallmark of human decision-making that is rarely captured by headlines. And it is in this liminal space that Harry's story resonates. Because most people, even outside royal contexts, navigate similar tensions. Loyalty versus autonomy, past versus present, obligation versus desire. The stakes in his life are amplified by fame, history, and public interest, but the emotional architecture is familiar. We all wrestle with identity that is partially inherited and partially chosen. We all grapple with belonging that is not always absolute. And we all experience moments where clarity is impossible, yet decisions must still be made. But the royal perspective adds a layer that is uniquely consequential. Within this context, every decision is scrutinized not just for personal consequences, but for cultural and symbolic ones. Choosing citizenship is not merely about self-definition. It is about signaling where allegiance lies, where priorities are placed, and what values are publicly affirmed. Harry, aware of the stakes, speaks with care, revealing truth while navigating diplomacy, and his response reflects both authenticity and strategy. Meanwhile, unanswered questions linger. How deeply does the palace influence his ongoing choices? To what extent does public expectation shape his willingness to commit to a new nationality? How much of his hesitancy is personal reflection, and how much is strategic positioning? And perhaps most intriguingly, how will the interplay between personal identity and institutional legacy continue to evolve as his children grow up, straddling two worlds themselves? These questions underscore the ongoing drama. Harry's journey is not static. Each decision, from interviews to public appearances to statements about citizenship, is part of a narrative still unfolding. And the tension between freedom and responsibility, past and present, personal desire, and inherited expectation, creates a dynamic that is both compelling and deeply human. And what happens next is where the story becomes truly revealing. Because even as Harry builds a life in California, he must confront the practical, legal, and symbolic implications of citizenship. He must engage with advisors, lawyers, and loved ones, all while maintaining his public image and protecting his family. Each conversation, each deliberation, adds layers of complexity. Each choice has ramifications that extend far beyond his immediate life. And the next chapter will show exactly how Harry navigates these decisions, the intersection of law, loyalty, and identity, and the moments that reveal both courage and vulnerability in ways that shock, inspire, and challenge public perception. When Prince Harry said, "There are no plans to be," at this point, the world heard a simple denial. But for those who understand the layers beneath that statement, the words carry immense weight. Citizenship is rarely a neutral act. It is both legal and symbolic. It signals allegiance, belonging, and a commitment to a country's values and systems. And for someone like Harry, whose life has been shaped by public scrutiny, family legacy, and personal trauma, citizenship is not merely a checkbox on a form. It is a declaration that carries consequences that ripple across identity, relationships, and legacy. Let's start with the legal dimension. Becoming a U.S. citizen is not automatic, even for residents with high-profile status. It requires residency, application processes, interviews, and oaths, all formalities that signify a binding relationship with a nation. For Harry, the practicalities are complicated by his dual exposure, financial obligations, prior British nationality, and international considerations. Citizenship could influence tax responsibilities, inheritance laws, and legal protections, all of which are intensified by the fact that he remains a public figure. Every detail must be meticulously considered, because even small oversights could become major public or legal controversies. But the legal side is only the tip of the iceberg. Citizenship carries symbolic weight that is much harder to quantify. For a man who grew up within the rigid traditions of monarchy, choosing a new nation is a profound declaration. It is not just about geography, it is about identity, allegiance, and public perception. To become American in the eyes of the world would mean formally embracing a life outside the structures that shaped him. It would signal a readiness to align his identity with the country he now calls home, to accept the responsibilities, privileges, and limitations that come with that alignment. And for someone whose every move has been interpreted, criticized, or politicized, the symbolic act of citizenship is enormous. Then there is the emotional layer. Harry is not making decisions in isolation. His choice about citizenship reflects his ongoing negotiation between past and present, between the life he was born into and the life he is creating for his family. It is bound up with loyalty to Britain, to his parents' legacy, to his role as a father, and to the personal values he and Meghan hold. Citizenship becomes a prism through which all of these tensions are magnified. Saying yes would assert a new allegiance, but it could also feel like a departure from the emotional and cultural bonds that connect him to his homeland. Saying no preserves ties but delays clarity, leaving him in a liminal space where identity remains unfinished. And let's not underestimate the social and public dimension. Every statement, every public appearance, every interview now becomes a narrative about where Harry stands. The media frames decisions as triumph or betrayal. Critics interpret hesitancy as weakness, and supporters read the pauses as thoughtfulness. Every potential step towards citizenship will be dissected, politicized, and analyzed. Even the phrase, "at this point," invites speculation. Is it uncertainty, pragmatism, strategic delay, or a genuine reflection of ongoing self-discovery? The ambiguity itself is a tool, allowing Harry to navigate the complexities without locking himself into a definitive position prematurely. But there is another layer that is less obvious: family influence. Decisions about citizenship are rarely individual when children, partners, and extended families are involved. Harry is thinking not only of himself, but also of Meghan, Archie, and Lilibet. How will citizenship shape their identity, their sense of belonging, their legal status, and even their sense of cultural alignment? For a father, these considerations are deeply personal and weighted. The decision is not abstract. It is living, ongoing, and intertwined with the people he loves most. This complexity explains why Harry's answer was deliberately open-ended. To commit outright would be to close doors emotionally and symbolically that may still be necessary for connection and reconciliation. To remain non-committal allows him the space to honor both the life he has left behind and the life he is creating. It reflects maturity, self-awareness, and strategic thinking. It is, in essence, a masterclass in navigating identity under the glare of public scrutiny. Yet, even with this understanding, questions linger. How much of Harry's delay is influenced by internal conflict? How much by external pressures from family, media, or advisors? And how much is simply a reflection of the human experience, the hesitation that arises when choices are both permanent and profoundly consequential? The interplay of law, symbolism, and emotion creates a unique tension that cannot be resolved with simple answers. And here is where the story deepens. Because the weight of citizenship is not simply about the present. It is about the future, about how Harry will define himself, how his children will grow up, and how his legacy will be perceived. Each potential decision reverberates decades forward, shaping not only his life but the narrative that the world constructs around him. The act of choosing or delaying is thus both intensely personal and inexorably public, a balancing act that requires constant reflection, courage, and strategic patience.